Have you ever noticed something strange about human connection? The people who like us the most, who show up consistently, who message first, who remember the small things, are often the ones we treat with the least care. Not because we're cruel, not because we want to hurt them, but because something in us recoils when affection comes too easily. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of this, if you've ever liked someone who responded to your warmth with coldness, your vulnerability with distance, your presence with absence, you know how confusing it is. You showed up as your best self, and somehow that became the problem. There's a paradox at the heart of human attraction that nobody really talks about. The more someone likes you, the less power they seem to hold. The more available they are, the less valuable they become. It's not logical, it's not kind, but it's real. So here's the question: why do women sometimes become mean to men who genuinely like them? And what does this pattern reveal about how we all navigate love, power, and vulnerability? Let me paint you a picture. You meet someone, the chemistry is immediate, laughter comes easily, conversation flows, there's that electric feeling of mutual recognition. You think, this could be something. So you do what feels natural. You text consistently, you make plans, you show genuine interest. You're available, present, honest about how you feel. And then something shifts. Her responses get shorter, the warmth cools, she cancels plans, or worse, makes vague suggestions that never materialize. When you're together, there's a subtle edge to her words, a testing quality. She's not quite mean, but she's not quite kind either. It's like she's daring you to pull back, waiting to see if you will. You're confused, you didn't change, your interest didn't waver. If anything, you became more thoughtful, more attentive, and somehow that made things worse. Here's what's really happening, and it's not what you think. The psychology behind this runs deeper than simple game playing or manipulation. It touches something fundamental about how we learned to associate love with uncertainty, affection with risk, and safety with suspicion. In attachment theory, there's a concept called avoidant attachment, a pattern formed in childhood when emotional needs were met inconsistently or when vulnerability was met with dismissal. People with this pattern learn an uncomfortable truth early: wanting something too much is dangerous. Showing your need is a liability. Safety doesn't come from connection. It comes from not needing connection at all. When someone with avoidant patterns encounters genuine, consistent affection, their nervous system doesn't register it as safe. It registers it as threatening. Because in their experience, love that comes easily is love that will disappear unexpectedly. Consistency feels like a trap, not a comfort. The person showing up reliably becomes a mirror reflecting their own capacity for need, and that's terrifying. So what do? They create distance, not always consciously, not always deliberately, but they test, they withdraw, they become critical or cold. They turn meanness into a shield. And here's what's fascinating: this isn't about you, it's about the unbearable vulnerability of being liked by someone who might actually stay. But there's another layer to this, one that's even more complex. We live in a culture that has taught us to associate value with scarcity. The things we can't have are the things we want most. The people who are distant, unavailable, slightly cruel, they become more attractive precisely because they withhold what we're seeking. It's not healthy, but it's deeply embedded in how we've learned to measure worth. When you show up consistently, when you make your interests clear, when you're emotionally available and honest, you're doing everything right. But in a system that equates distance with value, you've accidentally made yourself seem less desirable. Not because you are less desirable, but because the game has been rigged to reward withholding. A woman who has internalized these rules, who has learned that her own value increases when she's hard to reach, when she keeps people guessing, when she maintains emotional control, will unconsciously apply those same rules in reverse. The man who doesn't play the game, who doesn't strategize or manipulate, who simply shows up as himself, he breaks the pattern, and patterns breaking feels like chaos. So she becomes mean, not because she doesn't like you, but because your authenticity threatens the entire framework she's built around how connection is supposed to work. Here's the truth that makes this even more complicated. Sometimes the meanness is a test, not a conscious calculated test, but an unconscious one. She's checking to see if you'll stay when she shows you her sharp edges. She's waiting to see if your kindness was conditional, if it only existed when she was being her best self. Because everyone in her past who claimed to like her disappeared when things got difficult, when she got needy, when she got angry, when she got real. So she gets real early. She gets mean before you have a chance to leave. It's a preemptive strike against abandonment. And this is where it gets heartbreaking. The behavior that pushes you away is often the behavior that's trying to keep you close. The coldness is a question disguised as rejection. It's asking, will you stay even when I'm not easy to love? But here's the thing, you're not equipped to answer that question if you don't understand what's being asked. You just feel confused and hurt. You think you did something wrong. You start second-guessing everything. And ironically, you might pull away, not because you wanted to, but because the environment became inhospitable to authentic connection. Let me tell you what's happening in the brain during these interactions. When someone likes us, genuinely and openly, our mirror neurons light up. We feel their warmth, their interest, their vulnerability. For people with secure attachment, this creates connection. It feels good, it reinforces the bond. But for people with unresolved attachment wounds, that same neural mirroring becomes overwhelming. They feel your need for them, and it triggers their own buried need, the need they've spent years learning to suppress. They see your vulnerability, and it reflects back their own capacity for hurt. They sense your hope, and it awakens their long-dormant hope, the hope that has disappointed them before, so they shut it down. They become critical, distant, mean, not because they don't feel the connection, but because they feel it too much. There's a term in psychology called reaction formation, when we express the opposite of what we're actually feeling because the real feeling is too dangerous to acknowledge. Sometimes meanness is reaction formation. It's saying, I don't care about you because I'm terrified of how much I could care about you feels too vulnerable to admit. And maybe that's the real cruelty of this pattern. It punishes the very thing it secretly wants. You showed up with openness, honesty, consistency. Those are the building blocks of genuine intimacy. They're what makes love sustainable and real. But in a system where vulnerability is perceived as weakness, where need is seen as neediness, where showing up is interpreted as desperation, your strengths become liabilities. The man who texts first is too available. The man who makes plans is too eager. The man who expresses his feelings is too intense. There's no winning in a game where authenticity is penalized. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface. She's scared, not of you, of herself, of what it would mean to let someone in, of what it would require to be vulnerable, of the risk of disappointment and pain. Fear is the root of almost all meanness, not malice. Fear. Now let's address something important. Understanding why someone is mean doesn't mean you have to tolerate it. You can have compassion for someone's wounds while also recognizing that their unhealed trauma is creating harm. You can understand that someone's coldness comes from their own pain and still decide that you deserve better treatment. These things aren't contradictory. There's a difference between being patient with someone's growth and being a punching bag for someone's patterns. If you're consistently met with criticism, withdrawal, or cruelty when you show up authentically, that's not a challenge to overcome. It's information about compatibility. Because here's the truth, you cannot love someone into healing. You cannot prove through perfect behavior that you're safe. If someone has decided that vulnerability is dangerous, your consistency won't convince them otherwise. Only their own internal work can do that. And this is where it gets complex. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. Not as punishment, not as abandonment, but as a boundary that says, I won't participate in a dynamic where my kindness is treated as a flaw. Let me tell you about another mechanism at play here, the familiarity principle. Our nervous systems are attracted to what feels familiar, not necessarily what's healthy. If someone grew up in an environment where love was conditional, inconsistent, or came with criticism, that's what will feel like home in adulthood. The person who treats them well will feel foreign, suspicious, maybe even boring. It's why people who grow up with chaos often find peace uncomfortable. It's why those who experienced emotional unpredictability sometimes create drama in stable relationships. The familiar pattern, even when it's painful, feels safer than the unfamiliar one, even when it's genuinely good. So when you show up with steady, reliable affection, you're asking someone to step into unfamiliar territory. You're asking them to trust a kind of love they may have never experienced. That's not easy. It requires enormous courage to receive a type of care you've never known. And sometimes people aren't ready for that courage. Sometimes the meanness is them saying, I can't do this yet. I don't know how to be in this kind of connection. But here's what's fascinating and maybe hopeful. People can change these patterns. Not everyone who struggles with receiving affection will struggle forever. Not everyone who becomes mean when they're liked is permanently trapped in that behavior. Awareness is the first step. Therapy is often the second, and sometimes the right relationship at the right time can be transformative. But that relationship can only help if the person recognizes their pattern and wants to change it. if they're willing to sit with the discomfort of being treated well, if they're ready to challenge the stories they've been telling themselves about love and safety and vulnerability. You can't do that work for them. You can only decide whether you're willing to be present while they do it, or whether you need to protect your own heart and move on. There's something else we need to talk about: the role of power dynamics in all of this. Throughout history, women have often had less overt power than men, economically, physically, socially. In that context, the ability to withhold affection, to control the emotional temperature of a relationship, to decide when and how connection happens, these became forms of power that were available. When someone feels powerless in many areas of life, they often exercise control in the areas where they can. Relationships become a domain where they can assert autonomy, make decisions, set terms. Being mean to someone who likes them isn't always about fear or attachment wounds. Sometimes it's about finally being in the driver's seat. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps explain why the pattern exists so widely. Power imbalances in the broader culture create power struggles in individual relationships. When someone has spent their life feeling like they had to earn love, prove worth, or compete for attention, they might overcorrect when they finally have someone's consistent interest. The pendulum swings from "I'm not enough" to "I have the power to reject," without finding the middle ground of "I can receive love without losing myself." So where does this leave you? If you've been on the receiving end of this pattern, if you've liked someone who responded to your affection with coldness, your vulnerability with distance, your presence with cruelty, here's what I want you to know. You didn't do anything wrong. Showing up authentically is never a mistake. Being honest about your feelings is never something to regret. The fact that someone couldn't receive your warmth says everything about their capacity and nothing about your value. But also, you're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to decide that someone's unresolved patterns are not your responsibility to navigate. You're allowed to want a relationship where your consistency is met with appreciation, not punishment, where your vulnerability is met with tenderness, not testing, where showing up is seen as a gift, not a liability. The right person, someone who has done their work, who understands their patterns, who has learned that love doesn't have to hurt to be real, will not become mean when you like them. They'll become softer, they'll move closer, they'll match your courage with their own. There's a painful irony in all of this. The men who get treated worst are often the ones who would make the best partners, the ones who communicate clearly, who show up consistently, who don't play games, who lead with honesty and integrity. These men get penalized in early dating because the culture has taught us to mistake their steadiness for weakness, their availability for desperation, their kindness for lack of options. But these are exactly the qualities that build lasting, healthy relationships. The tragedy is that by the time someone realizes this, by the time they've dated enough unavailable people, enough players, enough emotionally distant partners who kept them in perpetual anxiety, the good ones who showed up early have moved on. And maybe that's the lesson here. Not everyone is ready to receive what you're offering, even when it's good, even when it's healthy, even when it's exactly what they say they want. Timing matters, readiness matters, self-awareness matters. You can be the right person doing all the right things and still be the wrong fit for someone who hasn't learned how to accept genuine care. Here's what I hope you take from this. If you're someone who becomes mean when someone likes you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, please know that understanding this is the first step toward changing it. You're not a bad person. You're a person with wounds that haven't healed yet, and those wounds are causing you to push away the very connection you're seeking. There's help available. Therapy can untangle these patterns. Self-reflection can illuminate why safety feels threatening. Time and intention can rewire what feels familiar. You deserve to experience love that doesn't terrify you, and the people who like you deserve to have their affection received with grace, not cruelty. If you're someone who has been on the receiving end, who has offered authentic care and been met with meanness, please know that you're not crazy. You're not imagining things. You're not too sensitive. You recognize the pattern that's real and painful and unfortunately common. And you get to decide what you do with that recognition. You get to choose whether you want to wait for someone to work through their patterns or whether you want to find someone whose patterns don't create harm. Both choices are valid. Both choices are yours to make. There's something beautiful, though, in truly understanding this dynamic, because once you see it, you stop taking it personally. You stop questioning your worth. You stop trying to be less of who you are in order to be more acceptable. You realize that someone's inability to receive your affection is not a referendum on your value. It's information about their capacity. And capacity is not fixed. People can grow, heal, expand, but growth requires willingness. It requires work. It requires honesty about the patterns that aren't serving us. Not everyone is ready for that work at the same time. Not everyone will choose it. And that's okay. You don't have to wait around to find out if someone will eventually be ready to appreciate what you've been offering all along. The right connection doesn't require you to become less. It invites you to become more honest, more vulnerable, more yourself. And it meets that offering with matching courage and openness. That's not naive. That's not idealistic. That's what healthy love actually looks like. So if you've been wondering why showing up authentically seems to push people away, why your kindness gets met with coldness, why your vulnerability creates distance, now you know. It's not about you. It's about unhealed wounds, cultural conditioning, power dynamics, and fear masquerading as control. And knowing this changes everything because it means you can stop trying to decode what you did wrong. You can stop trying to be different, better, more strategic. You can simply be yourself and trust that the right person, someone who has done their work, who recognizes the gift of genuine care, who doesn't need to test or punish or create distance to feel safe, will appreciate exactly what you're offering. The meanness was never about you. It was always about them, their fear, their patterns, their unresolved history. And you, with your open heart and honest intentions, deserve someone who doesn't need to learn how to receive love. Someone who already knows. Someone who says thank you for showing up instead of making you regret that you did. That person exists. That connection is possible. And it starts with refusing to accept less than what your authenticity deserves.